It was supposed to be the perfect escape. A simple weekend getaway. No grand plans, no complications. Just me, my dad, Brian, and his old friends, spending some time together before I left for my new job. A last hurrah, as Dad called it. A final moment of connection before everything changed. It had been a while since I'd truly spent time with him, and I figured this would be the perfect way to reset before diving into the whirlwind of my new life. I always thought my dad was the kind of guy who thrived on the little things. A quiet weekend in the woods, the smell of pine and fresh air, the warmth of a fire crackling under the night sky. These were the moments that truly made him feel alive. No need for anything fancy, just good company and the peaceful silence of nature. That's what I was expecting. Just a few days to unplug, get some fresh air, and reconnect with the one person I still felt I could rely on. But as we packed the car, tents, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of food, I felt an uneasy sense of anticipation brewing beneath my excitement. It was a fleeting thought, one I dismissed as I climbed into the passenger seat and let the sound of the engine fill the silence. My dad was in his element, telling me stories from his old police days, his voice light and carefree as he drove us toward the campsite. I couldn't help but smile. I loved hearing those stories, even if they were the same ones I'd heard 100 times before. The adrenaline in his voice was contagious, and for a moment, I felt like a kid again, safe and protected. But then, as we neared our destination, something in the air changed. It wasn't anything I could name, it was a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Maybe it was the quiet stillness of the forest as the city noise faded away, or maybe it was just me, overthinking things. But there it was, gnawing at the back of my mind like a whisper I couldn't ignore. When we finally arrived at the campsite, the first thing that hit me was the smell, the deep, earthy scent of damp soil and pine trees thick in the air. It reminded me that we were far from the familiar sounds of my apartment, far from the chaos of my usual life. This was supposed to be the peaceful retreat I'd been craving. But then my dad dropped the bombshell. "You know, Luke and the guys are joining us," he said casually, unloading the cooler from the back seat. "It'll be good for you to catch up with them too." I froze. The casual tone of his voice didn't match the shock I felt in my gut. Luke and the guys? I hadn't realized that Dad's old friends from the force would be there. I had only met Luke a few times before, but I remembered him well. He had that charisma, always the center of attention, always telling stories that left people laughing and leaning in, eager to hear more. He was energetic, fun, and charismatic, but there was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something a little too intense, a little too eager. It was in the way he spoke, the way he looked at you as if he was always measuring your reaction. I hadn't seen him in years, but I remembered that feeling all too clearly. As we started setting up camp, I could feel a sense of unease building inside me, a discomfort that I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't about the camping itself. It was something about Luke's presence, something I couldn't escape. I tried to push those thoughts away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a camping trip. What could go wrong? But as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the campfire flickered to life, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling. The night was beautiful, almost otherworldly. The sound of the fire crackling, the smell of wood burning, the stars slowly emerging from the velvet sky. Everything was perfect. And yet I couldn't shake the unease that lingered like a shadow. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being out here again, the weight of expectations that I put on myself to enjoy the trip. But deep down I couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't my dad told me Luke was coming? Was this really just about reconnecting with old friends? Or was there something more? I didn't know then, but I would soon find out. As we set up the tents, the usual banter began. Luke, Josh, and the others from Dad's old police crew swapped stories about their days on the force, reliving moments of danger, close calls, and their most memorable arrests. Their laughter filled the air, genuine at first, but there was an edge to it, a sense of something unspoken beneath their words. It wasn't just nostalgia. It felt like something else, something that lingered in the way they looked at each other, in the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. I stood to the side, trying to stay out of the way, as I watched them with a growing sense of discomfort. These men, they shared something, years of experiences that I could never truly be a part of, a bond built on shared danger and adrenaline. As I sat back, taking it all in, I realized that I didn't belong here. They were like a well-oiled machine, laughing at jokes that had layers I couldn't peel back. And then there was me, the outsider. The one who didn't fit in. I was used to being in Dad's world, but this felt different. The more they laughed, the more I felt myself shrinking back, unsure of where I fit into the picture. I wasn't just the daughter of one of them anymore. I was a stranger, an observer in a world I didn't understand. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself it was nothing, just a strange anxiety I had no reason to feel. But the longer I watched them, the more isolated I felt. That's when I felt it, a shift in the air. Luke's gaze, always so engaging with the group, had landed on me. It wasn't obvious at first. I thought it was just a casual glance. But the way his eyes lingered, like he was taking me in, studying me, something in me recoiled. It wasn't just a look of curiosity. There was something deeper in it, something unsettling. As he looked at me, his smile didn't reach his eyes. They were calculating, measuring. And that was when I realized he wasn't just looking at me like he was part of the group. He was looking at me like I was something to be figured out. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the weight of his gaze stayed with me. I turned my attention to the fire, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed. The crackling flames did little to ease the discomfort gnawing at my stomach. But it wasn't just the fire, it was Luke's attention. The way he always seemed to gravitate toward me, even in a crowd. As night fell, the conversation turned lighter. Stories of past camping trips, ghost tales, the usual jokes. It should have been relaxing, but the weight of his eyes on me made it hard to focus. I sat back, trying to enjoy the laughter, but my mind kept drifting back to Luke. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me again, and every time, I'd feel the knot in my stomach tighten. Then, just when I thought the night was winding down, Luke turned to me, his grin widening in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You know, Ava," he said casually, his voice low but sharp, "it's been a while since you've been out here with us. Think you're tough enough to handle a real adventure tomorrow?" His words cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. And in that moment, I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just making small talk. He was testing me, pushing me to see if I'd bite, to see if I'd take the bait. I hesitated. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat. I didn't want to seem weak, didn't want to be the one to back down. But every part of me screamed to avoid this, to steer clear of whatever game he was playing. I took a breath and forced a smile, trying to mask the unease that was building inside me. "I'm sure I can handle it," I said, trying to sound confident. But even as the words left my lips, I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of my neck. Luke's eyes twinkled with something dark, something I couldn't quite place. He patted my back with more force than necessary, the touch lingering just a little too long. "Good," he said, his voice almost playful. "It'll be a challenge. You'll see." I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple hike. It wasn't about the adventure, it was about control. About proving something, about making me prove something. And the way he looked at me, the way he smiled, told me this was just the beginning. I turned my gaze back to the fire. But the warmth it provided did little to comfort me. I knew then that this trip was already becoming something I wasn't prepared for. The fire's crackle seemed to echo in the silence between us, a reminder of the growing tension that was slowly rising around me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like something was off. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or maybe it was just the way the entire atmosphere felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, and the silence of the morning was eerie, like the world was waiting for something to happen. Every little noise, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. I pulled on my jacket and joined Dad and the guys, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Luke, the way he looked at me last night. We set off on the trail. The sounds of the forest around us, crunching leaves beneath our feet, the occasional call of a bird high above. The quiet was deafening in a way, unsettling. It was supposed to be peaceful. It should have been peaceful. But something felt wrong. The forest was too still, too quiet, and my heart was racing for no reason. It was like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up with yet. Luke was always a few paces ahead, leading the way, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow following just behind me. It wasn't enough that I could hear his footsteps. It was something in the air, the way his energy seemed to settle into the space around me, pushing closer, closing the gap even when we were apart. It made my skin crawl. Every time I turned my head, there he was, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made me feel exposed. I tried to focus on the hike, to focus on the path in front of me, but the weight of his gaze was constant. It felt like he was always watching, always waiting for me to react, to say something. And the more I resisted, the more it felt like I was suffocating, caught in a slow-motion trap I couldn't escape. We walked in near silence, with only the crunching of the leaves beneath our feet breaking through the quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking it. But then Luke slowed down, and I had to pull myself from my spiraling thoughts to catch up with him. My breath came in short bursts as we paused to rest, and I felt my heart rate quicken, not from the physical exertion, but from the rising tension that was thickening the air between us. Luke turned to me, his grin widening. "You know, Ava," he said, his voice low, almost too intimate, "you're tougher than I thought." His words hit me like a punch, though I wasn't sure why. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Thanks," I said. But the words felt hollow in my mouth. It wasn't his praise that unnerved me. It was the way he said it, the way his eyes didn't leave mine, studying me. There was something in his tone that made my skin prickle with unease. Then, without warning, he reached out and brushed his hand against my arm. It was a quick, casual gesture, but the moment his fingers brushed my skin, my whole body went stiff. His touch lingered longer than it should have. It wasn't the kind of touch you'd expect from an old friend. It wasn't warm. It wasn't reassuring. It was invasive, like he was trying to claim a space he had no right to. I froze, my pulse racing, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Why did it feel like the air had thickened around me, pressing in on me? Why was his hand still there, brushing against my arm when it should have been pulled away by now? I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for some kind of reaction, a shift in my body, a flinch. And I hated it. I hated how I couldn't pull away. I stepped back instinctively, trying to create some space between us, my heart hammering in my chest. But Luke didn't move, didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, but he didn't care. His smile never wavered. "Don't be so tense," he said with a chuckle, as though it was all just a joke, a game. But I could tell from the way his eyes locked onto mine that it wasn't a joke. There was something else, something darker behind that smile. I took another step back, this time with purpose, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place. I couldn't look away from him. I couldn't move fast enough. The more I tried to break the tension, the more it grew, wrapping around me like a vice. I was starting to feel trapped. Every word out of his mouth, every movement felt calculated, like he was testing the boundaries, like he was waiting to see how far he could push me before I broke, before I snapped. And I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I didn't give him what he wanted. Afraid of what he might do next if I didn't play along, if I didn't let him take control. I knew then that this wasn't just about the hike. This wasn't about a casual weekend in the woods. It was about power, control. And Luke was playing a game, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to play. We made our way back to camp, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My legs were sore from the hike, the muscles protesting with every step, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the exhaustion gnawing at me from the inside. My body was tired, yes, but it was the emotional weight that was wearing me down. The whole hike had felt like I was walking on a tightrope, trying to balance on a path that was growing narrower by the second. As we reached the camp, I let myself collapse onto a log by the fire, my mind still racing from everything that had happened. The others settled around the fire, swapping stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I wasn't in control of. It was like a slow burn, the heat building inside me, and I had no way of putting it out. Every time my eyes met Luke's, my heart skipped a beat. There was no escaping him. His gaze was everywhere, on me, waiting. I tried to focus on the fire, to drown out everything else, but I couldn't ignore him. It wasn't just physical anymore. It wasn't about him being too close or his touch lingering longer than it should. It was something darker. Something that hung between us in the space where words failed to fill. The air around us felt charged, thick with an energy I couldn't explain. and every time I tried to pull away, to break the connection, it only seemed to draw me in more. The crackling of the fire should have been comforting, but instead it only heightened the tension. The night seemed too quiet, too still. And with every sound, the snapping of twigs in the fire, the rustling of leaves, I felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything that was happening, trying to pull together the threads of what I knew and what I feared. I lay in my tent that night, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every small sound from the forest outside my tent seemed amplified. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, felt like a warning. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wilderness, that it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But I couldn't sleep. My heart wouldn't slow down and my mind was racing, running through every possible scenario. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luke's face, those eyes locked on mine like he was waiting for me to react. And then I heard it, the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I froze. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like someone was walking right beside my tent, just out of sight. I held my breath, trying to control the rising panic in my chest. My heart pounded loudly in my ears, and the world outside the tent felt like it had gone silent. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, absolutely still, praying to hear the sound of them moving away, praying that it was just an animal, that it was nothing more than the wind or the night playing tricks on my senses. But the silence only deepened the fear in my chest. The weight of the moment settled over me, like a heavy blanket pressing down, suffocating me with every passing second. Just as I thought I might scream, just as the fear reached its peak, the footsteps finally moved off. I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my body loosening just a fraction, but the unease remained. It was over, or so I thought. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing, but the thought of what just happened wouldn't leave me. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks or if someone had been there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was coming and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The next morning, everything felt different. It was as though the air itself had thickened overnight, pressing in on me, suffocating any sense of peace I had left. The tension between Luke and me was no longer subtle. It was palpable. A living thing that hovered in the space between us, always present, always growing. He wasn't hiding his interest anymore. It was clear, as obvious as the sun above us, that he was no longer playing coy. His jokes, which had once been light and easy, were sharper now, pointed in my direction with every word. His gestures weren't casual anymore. They were deliberate, calculated, as if he was trying to draw me in, force me to respond. I could feel his eyes on me every second, even when I wasn't looking at him. His gaze was like a weight, pressing against the back of my neck, making it impossible for me to ignore him. Every time our paths crossed, every time our eyes met, there was that flicker. Something unspoken and urgent. Something I couldn't put my finger on but felt deep in my chest. The air crackled with tension, and no matter how hard I tried to concentrate on the landscape around me, it was always there. That feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. Then, as we were walking together on the trail, trying to make our way back to camp, it happened. The moment I had been dreading, the moment I had tried so hard to avoid but knew deep down was inevitable. Luke slowed down, matching my pace, and for a split second, everything seemed to stop. The sounds of the forest, the crunching of leaves beneath our feet, the rustling of the wind through the trees, faded into the background. All I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears, the rush of adrenaline as I realized that there was no escape from this moment. His body was close to mine now, too close, and I could feel his presence pressing in on me. Without warning, he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze. My body locked in place as if my muscles had forgotten how to move. His hand brushed against my cheek, soft at first, but the touch lingered, sending a jolt through me. It was a simple gesture, so gentle, so innocent, or at least it seemed that way, but in that moment it felt like everything was on the line. "Ava," he whispered, his voice low and steady, as if he had been waiting for this moment for longer than I could comprehend. I've been waiting for this moment. The world around us disappeared, leaving only him, his eyes dark and unreadable, his lips drawing closer to mine. Before I could even process what was happening, before I could think to pull away, he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but the pressure was unmistakable, like he was claiming a part of me that I wasn't sure I was ready to give. My heart raced in my chest, a wild, frantic rhythm that mirrored the panic rising inside me. I wanted to pull away, to run, but my body betrayed me. I stood frozen, caught in the moment, unable to tear myself away from the pull of his lips. Just for a second I responded. It was like a reflex, something instinctual that I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. But then the clarity hit, and I pulled back, my mind swirling with confusion and disbelief. What had just happened? What had I allowed to happen? I stumbled back, taking in a shaky breath, my thoughts a tangled mess. What? What was that? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, as though I could barely bring myself to speak the question aloud. Luke just smiled, his eyes dark and unreadable, like he knew something I didn't. His lips curled in that familiar, knowing way. Sometimes you just have to go with what feels right, he said, his words calm, almost too calm for the storm that was raging inside me. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to feel, what to say. The words I wanted to say were stuck in my throat, tangled with the confusion and fear that was settling into my bones. I wanted to scream, to run far away, but all I could do was stand there, my legs weak beneath me, the world around me spinning out of control. The forest around us seemed to grow still, the wind quieting, the trees holding their breath. It was like time had stopped, like everything had paused in that moment, waiting for something, waiting for me to react. But what was there to say? What was there to do? The kiss had shattered something that couldn't be fixed. This trip had changed everything, and there was no going back. The rest of the trip felt like a blur. Everything was muted, distant, as if I were floating just above the ground, watching the events unfold rather than actually living them. My thoughts were consumed by the kiss, by what it meant and the chaos it had unleashed inside me. I kept replaying it in my head, over and over, trying to understand what had happened, what I had allowed to happen. But no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind, the answers never came. The once peaceful forest, which had seemed so welcoming and serene when we first arrived, now felt like a cage. The towering trees, the rustling leaves, the birds chirping, all of it seemed to close in around me, suffocating me. The quiet that had once been calming was now deafening, a constant reminder of the growing tension between Luke and me. Every glance, every word he spoke felt heavy with unspoken intent, pushing me further into a space I couldn't escape. I couldn't ignore him, but more than that, I couldn't ignore what he was doing to me. First, I had thought it was just physical attraction, a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, maybe. But as the days dragged on, I realized there was so much more at play than that. It wasn't just about desire or lust. It was power, control, and manipulation. Luke wasn't just testing my limits, he was pushing me inch by inch to see how far he could go, how far I would go. And somehow I was letting him. I was playing along, allowing myself to get caught in his web. Each time we crossed paths, his presence was more intense, more overwhelming. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke, every touch, each action was calculated, meant to stir something deep inside me. He wasn't just trying to draw me in. He was trying to break me down piece by piece. And every time I resisted, every time I tried to pull away, he would just come back stronger, more insistent. I hated that I was playing into it. I hated that I was letting him have this control over me. But I couldn't help it. Something inside me wanted to believe it was just the heat of the moment, that I could push through it, that it was all just temporary. But the truth was, it was never just about the moment, it was about him testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I cracked. By the time we packed up and left the forest, I felt like a different person. The girl who had arrived just days ago, the girl who was excited for a peaceful trip with her dad, was gone. In her place was someone unfamiliar, someone I didn't recognize. I felt like I had been hollowed out, like something vital had been taken from me, but I wasn't sure what. When I got the text from Luke later that night, "Hope you're okay. Let's talk soon," I felt a cold shiver run through me. The words seemed innocent enough, but I knew better. I knew the story wasn't over. It wasn't just some casual conversation. It was a hook, a way to keep me tethered to him, to keep me thinking about him. And I hated that he had that kind of power over me. This trip had only been the beginning. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever game he was playing, whatever twisted dynamic he had drawn me into, it wasn't finished. And that thought filled me with a mixture of dread and something else I couldn't name. A longing, maybe? Or a need to resolve the mess he'd created. But one thing was certain. I wasn't free. Not yet.
As the final echoes of this story fade away, one thing becomes clear. This journey isn't just about the woods, the wilderness, or the twisted games of power and control. It's a reminder about boundaries, how easily they can be tested, crossed, and broken. It's about the choices we make, the moments that shape us. And the people who walk into our lives with the potential to leave their mark, for better or worse. Sometimes, the hardest battles we fight are the ones inside us, the ones we don't see coming. So, what do you think? What's your takeaway from Ava's journey? Have you ever found yourself at a crossroads like this, unsure of which way to turn? But knowing that what happens next could change everything? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share your own experiences, and let's get the conversation started. And hey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got more stories lined up, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you in the next one.